I was born in Australia in 1951. My parents were just middle-class, fairly ordinary people. They weren't particularly religious, conventionally religious, never went to church. But from an early age I was interested in religion, and I went to church on my own accord. Later on, first year of high school, I became a Methodist. I was actually baptized. And then later I got sort of interested in a slightly evangelical sect. But by the time I was about 17, it left me. I didn't leave it, as it were. But I still had this religious interest in religion. So I started looking around for other things, mainly other Christian sects, because I just really didn't think of anything beyond that. Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Quakers, that sort of thing. But one day, by chance, I saw a book on Buddhism. It was called The Mind Unshaken. It was written by a man called John Walters. He was the London Times correspondent in Burma in the 1950s. And he had become a Buddhist, and he wrote a book about why he became a Buddhist, explaining Buddhism. And this really interested me. I didn't understand all of it, but what I did understand made really quite sense to me. So then I started looking around for books on Buddhism, and I went to the public library, and there was exactly one book, and it was called by the Chinese philosopher Lin Yutang. And he had written a book in the 1930s called The Wisdom of the East. And in it he had the Bhagavad Gita, the Analects of Confucius, and etc. And one section was called the Dhammapada, the words of the Buddha. And I wanted that. I didn't want to read a book about Buddhism. I wanted to know, what did the Buddha teach? So I sort of looked around, and when nobody in the library was looking, I stole that book. And I took it home and I tore the book up so that I just had the section on the Dhammapada. I took it to a bookbinder and he put a cover on it, and I had my own The Words of the Buddha. But I just want to mention that that my first step in Buddhism wasn't a particularly good one, but many years later I saw that book in somebody else's library, and it reminded me of what I've done as an immature person. So I asked my parents to get me the name and the address of the library, local library, which they did do. And I bought some books on Buddhism, and I wrote a letter. I didn't sign the letter, saying that many years ago I stole a book from your library and I want to make up for it. So that's what I did. Anyway, from that time onwards, I became really interested in it, I suppose as teenagers do. And then there was a sort of the period which I think a lot of Buddhists go through, the trying to muddle your way through to figure out, what's the difference between Zen and what is a Bodhisattva and what the hell is Mahayana and this and that. I remember reading Dr. Suzuki's essays in Zen Buddhism and being completely baffled. I couldn't figure out how this, but eventually I settled on what we would call Theravada Buddhism, or what I call early Buddhism. And from that time onwards, I called myself a Buddhist. And by the time I was about 20, I had this desire to become a monk. And even now, when people ask me, why did you become a monk? I always say, because I had no idea what I was doing. But certainly I knew my Buddhism quite well by that time. And so when I was 23 or 24, I went to Asia. I went to Thailand with the intention of becoming a monk there. On the way from Malaysia to Bangkok on the train, I met a man who had been a monk for many years. He was a Chao Kun. We started talking. He was sitting in the seat next to me, And he was quite nice to me when I told him that I'd come to Thailand with the intention of becoming a Buddhist. And when we got to Bangkok, he invited me to stay with him, and he introduced me to various monks around Bangkok. And then later one of his friends took me to Laos, and so I had a good introduction even before I became a monk. But I'd have to tell you that most of what I saw in Thailand didn't really impress me. So I decided that I didn't want to become a monk in Thailand or in Laos. So this was 1973, incidentally. So I decided to try Burma. So I went to Burma, and in those days foreigners were only allowed to stay in Burma for 7 days. So first time I was there, I really didn't meet anybody until the very end, because I was meditating in a park one day, or trying to meditate, and some Burmese people came up, and when I'd finished meditating, they started talking to me, and they introduced me to their meditation teacher, who was U Panadipa, who was a senior monk in the Kabaye Pagoda in Yangon. And by that time, my visa was just about finished. I had 2 days left. So we planned that I would come back and do a 7-day meditation course there, which is what happened. I went back to Bangkok. I got a renewed visa. I went and I spent 7 days doing meditation, and that was my introduction to it. It didn't really click with me, but that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to find out about it. So I did that one more time, went back to Bangkok, came again. And on the 4th time, I decided to go to North Burma. I took a plane to Mandalay, and I went down through with a young Burmese friend who was associated with this meditation center, and I visited Bagan and places like that. And then I was at a loose end. I didn't really want to go back to Thailand, and I really didn't know anything about Buddhism in India, and I can't remember really ever thinking about Sri Lanka as a possibility. So I decided, well, the Buddha was in India and I'll go to India. So I went to India, and then I spent the next 3 or 4 years there. I learned yoga. I did a meditation course very early with Goenka, who had just recently left Burma. I visited all the Buddhist sacred places. It was actually a rather good time in India at that time. It's very different from now. Anyway, I did a Goenka course which inspired me a great deal with Goenka. He was actually doing the teaching at that time. And I still vividly remember on the 3rd day or something wanting to escape because of the pain in the legs. And I thought, after the talk tonight, I'm going to quietly leave. Also, it was in a very confined, small place full of maybe 50 Westerners right next to each other. It was stinking hot. It was difficult. Anyway, Goenka came out that night and he let out a big laugh and he just said, "Dukkha." Oh, ho, 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 ho. And he inspired not only me, I think everybody else, very skillfully to get us to stay without insisting that we do so. He talked about suffering and what have you and that. So I completed the whole 7-day course, and in the next few years I did several others with him also, and I started doing that particular practice. But my intention really was to become a monk. During my trips around the Buddhist sacred places, when I went to Shravasti, which is where the Buddha spent the last 20 years of his life, there was a Sri Lankan monk living there all alone. Once again, it is much more developed nowadays, but in those days it was a very remote and extremely poor area. So I stayed there, and it was such a lovely place, and he was very kindly to me. And he taught me the Mangala Sutta, the Metta Sutta. He really didn't know very much about meditation, but he was very well grounded in the Buddhist tradition. He started teaching me some Pali and what have you. And 1 week led to 4 weeks, and then 1 month led to 3 or 4 months. And so eventually, and because I told him that I wanted to become a monk, he said, well, I'll make you a novice, samanera. So I became a monk under the Ananda Bodhi tree in Shravasti. And then that was in 1976. But he said, and I understood that it was correct, that I was never going to be able to learn very much in India. He had friends in Sri Lanka, so he gave me some addresses of people in Sri Lanka. And so I decided to go to Sri Lanka. And I decided from North India to walk all the way to Sri Lanka. These are the foolish things you do when you're young and full of enthusiasm and what have you. I had no shoes, I had virtually no money. And so over the next month or two, that's exactly what I did. But I don't know how many hundreds of kilometers I walked, but certainly many hundreds of kilometers. But then people gave me train tickets and bus drivers stopped, long distance buses stopped for me and that. And eventually I got to Rameshwaram, right at the tip of India. And by that time I had no money at all. I didn't have very much earlier. And I begged for my food all the way, particularly in South India. Tamil people were still very aware of the tradition of alms to swamis and sannyasis, and so I never had any trouble. Food wasn't necessarily good, and it wasn't necessarily very hygienic, but I never got sick. Anyway, I got to the ferry. They had in those days there was a beautiful old ferry which got sunk during the Civil War in Sri Lanka a few years ago, but it was from the early 1900s. It'd be all polished brass, and it was a lovely old ship. Anyway, I went to the office there, and I said I wanted to go to Sri Lanka, and they said, well, you'll have to pay. And I said, I don't have any money. And they said, well, you know, no money, and you can't give you a ticket. I said, look, I'm a swami. Well, it made no difference. So then I thought, well, what on earth am I going to do? So very near the ferry terminal, because in those days at least, it was only a small town of very low houses dominated by this vast Rameshwaram temple. It's a huge place. So I decided to spend the day walking around that temple. And as I was going down one of these huge colonnades, the temple elephant walked past me. And then I went around, and when I came back around again, the elephant had stopped there, and the elephant driver it must have been his tea break or something like that, and he was getting money from pilgrims by allowing them to walk underneath the elephant. The Indians believe that if you walk underneath an elephant, it's very auspicious. And there was an old tin there, and when they walked under the elephant, they'd put a few paise or a 1 rupee note or something like that. And I just stopped and watched this for a while, and I'm not telling a story, this is absolutely true. The elephant picked up the tin and gave it to me. He pushed it against me. And I pushed it away, and the elephant driver indicated that I could have it. And again I refused, and again the elephant pushed this tin at me, and the elephant driver said, no, take it. So I took it, and when I counted it out, it was just it was a few paise beyond the cost of the ticket, and that's how I got the ticket. But the funny thing is that when I went the next day to the ticket office, I had to count out, because it was all, you know, in those days, the 1 paise, 2 paise, 5 paise, these very, very small coins. So I had to sort of put them all out and put them in little piles and what have you. And this man who remembered me from the day before, he looked at this, and when I said, there, that's the exact amount, and he said, Ganapati, meaning Ganesh, the god of good luck. He said, Ganapati has been good to you. So that's how I got to Sri Lanka. That was in 1976, when after 7 years of the United Front government, the economy was in an absolute mess. There was widespread hunger. I mean, the country was really woebegone. So I stayed in a place called Sri Lanka Vidyalaya, which was a monastic college which had a fairly good reputation. I learned Pali there. I stayed there for a year, and I still consider it to be my temple, my home temple, as it were, and they consider me to be a member of that temple. But after a year, I really wanted to learn meditation, and in this place there was no meditation. It was for academic studies. So I started going out for 2 or 3 weeks looking around, and eventually I ended up in Kandy, which is the old royal capital, where the temperature is much cooler and more pleasant. And I can't remember exactly where I stayed or what I did, but I ended up being in a temple there. And then I met people from the university, and they were very, very dedicated Buddhists, academics, but also very dedicated Buddhists. And they had a Sangharam, the university Sangharam, the university monastery. In 1970, they had a students' revolution there, and the monks were involved in this. So they closed down the monastery, and since that time it had been empty. So I was invited to become the chief monk there, as it were. And none of the students were the slightest bit interested in Buddhism. They were all interested in Marxist politics. But some of the professors were. So we formed a small group there, and we called ourselves Weluwana, because the Weluwana, which was the Buddha's first monastery donated to the Buddha, it is said it was not too near the city and not too far. And the university Sangharam was not too close to the university and not too far away. So we called it Weluwana, and that became a regular group. We meditated, we had international guests who would sometimes come to the university, all sorts of interesting people. So that's what I did for a long time. And then eventually one outsider from the university, quite a wealthy, prosperous tea merchant, he joined our group, and he had become very, very interested in meditation. And he said, you know, we should start a meditation center. So he donated the land, he built the buildings, etc. And that became the Nilambe Meditation Center, which for quite a few years became quite well known in Sri Lanka, mainly with Westerners, but later on local people, Sri Lankans, started coming. And in typical Sri Lankan fashion, you might say, they built the meditation center without thinking, do we have a meditation teacher? So after the thing was built and everything, then it was, what are we going to do now? So being the only monk as a part of this group, they said, you know, Bhante, you've got to do the meditation. And I had no idea how to, I had a regular meditation practice, still doing the Goenka technique, but I had no idea how to run a course or anything like that. So I decided to go to India again and do a course with Goenka. And I did that in his center in Hyderabad. But while everybody else had their eyes closed and meditating, I was sort of taking notes on, you know, how to and how to structure a course. So I did the first meditation course there. People seemed to like it, and then gradually became fairly well known, and then later on became very well known. So we would have 50, sometimes more than that, people. So the first 10 days of every month we would have a meditation course. And then one member of our group was Mr. Godwin Samaratna. He was the librarian in the public library in Kandy, a very exceptional individual. Not so much a meditator as a meditative. He was, in fact, I would say, the most meditative person that I have ever met. And he wanted to retire, and he moved up to the meditation center. And that allowed me to withdraw, and he gradually became the teacher there. And then it really started to have quite an impact. He was a very, very exceptional person. And then in 1985, I think it was, the Civil War was getting very unpleasant at that time. and foreigners like myself who ventured to give their opinion about it very quickly became very unpopular. The atmosphere was very, very poisoned. So I decided it was time to move on. So I moved to Singapore. I was invited by a well-known monk there who had a place called the Buddhist Library to become one of their teachers there. So then I lived there for the next 20 years. I decided that I wanted to withdraw from public activities when I was 65. So January 2016 I announced that I was going to leave, and in February 2017 I did. And now I've returned to Australia, and now I'm living here in sort of semi-retirement, semi-seclusion, if you like. So that's an outline of my story.
So, but are you still practicing Goenka, or your meditation practice has changed over the years, and maybe you can tell us how it gradually changed with the experience?
Well, the first meditation I did, and for 6 or 7 months, was the Mahasi technique. That's what I was taught in Burma, and that was okay. And then, but when I started the Goenka technique, first of all, it wasn't so much the technique, it was how inspiring Goenka was. So I did that for the next few years, and I think it is a really good technique for beginners. It is clearly structured, everybody does it the same way, it's explained why you do it in this particular way and what results there will be. It's very, very structured, and it delivers results. So I did that for a while, for 2 or 3 years, but then I felt that it was too rigid. Not just structured, but actually rigid. And as I learned more and more about Buddhist psychology, and particularly meditation, I felt that some of the explanations were, let's just say, interesting, not very convincing. And also I gradually came to feel, although I never got this from Goenka, I did get it from Goenka people, that they tend to be rather bigoted and narrow-minded concerning other types of meditation. The tendency seems to be there is meditation, vipassana, which means what Goenka does, and then there are other ones which we don't discuss very much. And I think that this is invalid. But I think that anybody can benefit from starting with the Goenka technique, and benefit a lot. But I think after a while you need to move on. And in my case, how I moved on was, as I got to know Godwin Samaratna better, I felt that that was the way for me. And it was at that time too in Sri Lanka that Ajahn Chah's writings were becoming well known. And in fact, in Nilambe, our meditation center, at the very beginning, we had visits from Jack Cornfield and Joseph Goldstein. And later on, Cornfield came back. When he was doing the book, The Still Forest Pool, if I remember correctly, he did a 3-month retreat there, and once a week myself and some others would talk to him. A combination of talking to and discussing and talking about meditation with Godwin and the Ajahn Chah approach, the combination of these two led me to start doing this way, unstructured, practical, immediate, and my feeling is very authentic. I don't think something as complex as the human mind can, any one technique, particularly if it's a very specific technique, can be suitable for everybody. I don't think that's right. Secondly, things like in many traditional approaches, things like metta bhavana or loving kindness meditation are seen as sort of a way to deal with a problem, the problem of resentment or hatred. So rather than seeing metta as something good in itself, it's seen simply as an antidote to hatred, and I think that is to misunderstand its true importance. So my understanding is that what we would normally call vipassana, and I use that term very carefully, I would say that that is to harness the noic capacity of consciousness, and that metta is to harness the emotional aspect of consciousness. And I think that these two together need to be addressed. So that's what I do. Mindfulness of breathing, often and sometimes for a whole sitting. At other times I will start with that and then move on to just watching. And at other times I will do that and then maybe towards the end of my meditation I might do metta bhavana for 10 minutes or 20 minutes. Or sometimes I just feel like it, so I do that for the whole sitting. That's what I do. Having been a monk for, it's going on 42 years, I speak to 20 different meditators and they give me 20 different explanations of what jhana is. Or when we talk about vipassana, I mean, there are a wide variety of explanations. Now, they all have something in common, but sometimes they can be very insistent that no, it is not that, it is this. And so I think it's quite unhelpful to even use those terms. So I don't, if I'm teaching meditation, and I don't do it very much anymore, but for a long time I wouldn't use these terms because they are what we say in English, loaded terms. As soon as people hear it, particular, very specific ideas come into their mind. So I think it's best just to talk about focus or tranquility or, you know, put your legs like this or put your hands like this rather than putting these labels on. Now I happen to think that those concepts are very, very important, but the reality is that many different people have many different understandings of what they mean. So it's best just to keep that out of it. I compare it to rowing a boat. So if you pull too hard on one oar, you'll go around in a circle. You have to pull both of them. And at some time, you might be rowing against the current, in which case you have to really... At other times, the current is helping you move along, in which case you can put the oars up and just allow yourself to be carried along. And then while you're being carried along by that, suddenly you realize there's a waterfall down, and now you have to change direction, and so on. So once again, this is the problem with a specific technique. It doesn't allow for that. I think, once again, when I talk to meditators, quite often I hear them say, you know, have you reached the 5th stage yet? Or, I was at the 4th stage last week, but now I fell off, and now, do you think it's possible? This is what I have discovered. I meet people doing all sorts of different techniques, and none of them seem to have benefited. And then I meet some others who have done the same techniques, and they seem to have really benefited. And I met others who have done exactly the same techniques, and they've deteriorated. They've ended up actually having even some personality problems. So it seems to me that the technique, or techniques, that's not the key. The key is some other things. And I think these other things are things like, I think that a very good guide to whether your meditation is working or not is how you are feeling. If you're more relaxed, if you're more sensitive and aware to what's going in your mind when you're not meditating, if some of your friends comment, they've noticed that you seem to smile more nowadays and you don't have the sharp edge that you used to have, I think that's a very good sign. And once again, I meet meditators who seem to be anything but calm, rigid, dogmatic. These are not good signs to me. So once again, the technique may... Now there's some techniques that I think are very good, there are others that I think are not good at all. But generally speaking, I think that the key is not the particular technique. That's my feeling.
So Bhante, can Buddhism help the Western societies, and how can he do that?
The main area where it seems to have had some impact is in psychology, which is not surprising. So the mindfulness movement nowadays certainly grew out of Buddhism. Now Buddhism doesn't get much of a mention in it, but that is an authentic and original and relatively unique aspect of Buddhism, which seems to have now overflowed from people just interested in religion to things like counseling and psychology and what have you. And that, I think that's quite a significant thing. Then we've got things like, nowadays they're exploring things like environmental ethics and just ethics in general, and I think Buddhism has some important contributions it can make in areas like that, and to some degree already has. Beyond that, I think perhaps simply offering itself or being there as a possible alternative, a spirituality which does not require the belief in a god or some other sort of metaphysical and concepts that a lot of people have a problem believing nowadays. So simply being there, making itself available to anybody who's interested, I think that's an important thing also.
But the Western world need Buddhist monks.
Although a lot of people may not be aware of it, I think the Sangha, that's the Bhikkhu Sangha, is in crisis in all Buddhist countries. There are really very serious problems, organizational problems, discipline problems, etc. And so far I don't really see any, even an awareness that there is a problem that needs to be addressed. So countries like Thailand and Sri Lanka, which are rapidly developing and westernizing and becoming consumer societies, and I think that every year the Sangha gets more and more behind. What happens there, we'll have to wait and see. But I can't say that I see a light on the horizon at present. As for the West, my feeling is, and my hope is, that there will always be an institution where those who sincerely wish to become monastics, become monks, can do that. But I think the numbers will always be small. And if we look at the statistics of the Western Sangha at present, this tells us a lot. So going back to the early 1900s, when you start having the first Western monks, the number of Western monks has always been very, very small. It's been insignificant, and yet their contribution to the development of Buddhism has been enormous and positive, almost entirely positive. Even nowadays, you look at somebody like Bhikkhu Bodhi, an American monk, Bhikkhu Bodhi, one man has done lucid, clear, accurate translation of nearly the whole of the Sutta Pitaka and continues to work on it. I mean, it's really remarkable that one person could do this. So the first thing is their contribution goes far beyond their number, or I should say, our number. Okay. But I think if Buddhism is to flourish in the West, we can't rely upon monks because their numbers are always going to be too small. There are hundreds of Buddhist organizations, societies in the world which do not have a monk. And quite often they stall because they think we've got to have a monk and they can't get one. And so what happens is they tend to sort of mark time or muddle through. So I think what the people like, or organizations like the Insight Meditation Center in Barre in Massachusetts, they're starting to have, they've built colleges where lay people can come and become Buddhist teachers. Now I don't know how successful that is, but at present, but I would say that that would be the way to go. Because the number of monks and nuns is always going to be, it's never going to be big enough.
Or maybe the Vinaya is it's like outdated law?
Well, the Vinaya became outdated within 100 years of the Buddha. The evidence is overwhelming that throughout history, parts of them have been ignored, while others have been emphasized, but most of it is, and always has been, ignored. And that's only right, because how things were in central India in the 5th century BC is very, very different from how things were in central India in 5th century AD. And they bear no resemblance whatsoever to how things are in central India in the year 2018. And also, I think it's worth pointing out that for 20 years there was no Vinaya. So the tradition tells us. So I think there's a chronic need for sensible, practical discipline. There is a need for discipline which may not be practical as far as the world is concerned, but for training the mind and for building character. I think this is very, very important. So there's a need for that. And I think there's perhaps a need for rules which are distinct for a Buddhist monk, that show that you're not just a monastic, you're a particular type of monastic. So I think, and I hope that that would always remain, but such a large percentage of the rules are really, well, in fact, very few of the rules are about morality. Most of them are about etiquette. Now, if you went to Tibet in 1950, the most significant, the highest respect you could give to somebody was sticking your tongue out. So the concept of etiquette and good manners and gracious behavior in the 5th century BC is completely different from how it is in our society. So those things can be, and really most of them have been, simply ignored. So what needs to be done is to look at those rules which pertain to morality, those which pertain to training and character building, and they should be emphasized, and then the other ones simply ignored and replaced by ones that suit our society. I heard a case, I think it was somewhere in Europe, where the first monk came back in the 70s or something like that. He was a Westerner who'd been in Thailand for many years, and he was welcomed by the group who put out their hand to shake his hand, and he immediately told them in a very imperious manner that monks don't shake hands. And I think that he was wrong to do that, because in the West that is considered and there's nothing wrong with that. That's as gracious as this or anything else. And to make such a, well, it was interpreted as imperious and rude, and that's what it was completely unhelpful and very insensitive of him. So what is considered good manners in one place is considered perhaps even bad manners in another, and I think that has to be taken into account.
Right, so what are your future projects?
Well, I've just finished a new book, and it's with the publisher now, and now I've embarked on something I've wanted to do for a long time, which is write a very definitive biography of the Buddha, based only on the earliest material, the Pali Tipitaka. And then with a group of academics in Indonesia, we are doing a book on daily life as it is depicted on the great stupa of Borobudur. That will take maybe a year or two. And hopefully I can do that before I go to another world.
Well, so really hope you will finish all the projects.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.